All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our lesson for this week. It is on the origins of the Cold War. So your objectives and standards to explain the rise of conflict in the post-war period and to analyze the policy of containment. And take a look at the standards too, please. And our vocabulary preview, satellite nations and containment. And I want you to think about this. So when you look at this map, you'll see, it's a map of a certain area. So I want to know if you can identify what this is a map of. You can tell me that. And then also looking at these colors, like what could this map possibly be representing, or what could it be standing for? Any thoughts you can give on it. And again, please answer something to think about this section. These are free, easy points for you. I give you credit for it as long as you answer it. It doesn't have to be a right or wrong answer. So again, what is this a map of? And what could it possibly be showing with the two different colors? Okay. And our central question, how did the Cold War begin? All right, so at the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union were both skeptical of each other. We're going to talk about even during World War II, both the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of skeptical of each other. So in the Soviet Union, what you have is a state or a government that controls all economic activity, which is under a totalitarian government. Okay, so it's just like a dictatorship. Okay, and that's in comparison to the United States, where private citizens controlled the economy in a government that was elected by them. We know that in the United States we elect our own leaders. So that's in comparison to the Soviet Union. Where things are much different. So that raises some issues between the two countries. So during the war, the United States was angry at Stalin and the Soviet Union for forming an alliance with Hitler and Germany at the beginning of the war. Remember we talked about this, how they had signed a non-aggression pact, and that changed when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. But before that, Stalin was with Germany invading countries and gaining territory. So the United States wasn't too happy with him about that. On the flip side, Stalin was furious with the Americans and Allied forces for not attacking the Germans sooner in Europe. He believed that they should have taken quicker steps to especially prevent maybe a possible invasion of the Soviet Union. And he was also angry with the idea that the Americans had been developing secretly an atomic weapon. So he was kind of annoyed that we didn't tell him about that as well. Now, there was still a hope for peace at the end of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. So in April 1945, 50 nations met in San Francisco, California to establish a new international organization. Now, this was kind of like the League of Nations, which we had talked about after World War I. Their goal was to establish world peace, settle disputes between countries, but the difference between them and the League of Nations is they have a little more power, and that's why they are kind of still around today as well. So in June of 1945, the United Nations was created. And the United States and the Soviet Union will join the United Nations, but both are going to compete for power both in the United Nations by trying to win allies, and they're also going to compete around the world as well. Okay, Potsdam. So remember that President Truman became president in April 1945 after the death of President Roosevelt. So he had only really been a leader of the United States for a few months in July 1945. Now remember, in July 1945, Germany had already surrendered, but we were still fighting a war in the Pacific against the Japanese. The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union met in Potsdam near Berlin in Germany. Truman, who was President of the United States, Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. A side note here is that Churchill was no longer Prime Minister. His party had lost in some elections, and so he was kind of ousted from power as Prime Minister. And Stalin, who had been in control the whole time, met to discuss the end of the war. Now, prior to this, remember that Stalin had promised a democratic free election in Poland, which the Soviet Union controlled still, but it was soon clear that he's not going to allow that to happen. So the Soviet Union wanted to take war reparations or war payments from Germany, but President Truman is going to object to this. It is agreed that the four allied nations would take reparations from their occupation zones, which we talked about last week in Germany. The United States also wanted access to natural resources in Eastern Europe and trade opportunities, but Stalin is determined to keep the West out of those areas, so he's not really going to allow too much access in terms of that. So the Soviet setup. So in Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Poland, Stalin installed communist governments. And these are going to become known as satellite nations, or countries under the rule of the Soviet Union. Stalin also stated that capitalism and communism would never agree, and that war could not be prevented between the two. So this is obviously going to upset a lot of the American leaders. So again, faced with the threats by the Soviet Union, the American government decides to take action as well. So an American diplomat in Moscow, George F. Kennan, I believe is his last name, came up with a policy of what is known as containment. And you're going to see this word come up for a lot during the Cold War and within the course as we talk about, as we work through the course for the next couple of decades. But containment is preventing the extension of communism to other countries. So this was a new idea, but it is, like I said, it's going to be the leading foreign policy idea for the United States for many, many years to come. So the Iron Curtain. So in March 1946, former Prime Minister Winston Churchill gives a speech in the United States. He stated that an Iron Curtain had descended and divided Europe into capitalist and communist, and that is what that map shows you in the beginning, is the division between the capitalist countries and the communist countries, the communist being the red countries and the capitalist countries being in blue. And this phrase, the Iron Curtain, is going to remain for the duration of the Cold War, and it's going to represent this kind of division between communism and capitalism, the United States and its allies against the Soviet Union and its allies as well. Okay, so just kind of wrapping up here. The United States and the Soviet Union began to not trust each other at the end of World War II and definitely following World War II. And both sides are going to set up policies to build up their own strength and to also weaken the other. Okay, so that's all I have for this lesson. So again, please make sure you do the think about this question and also be sure to answer the questions that go along with it. And I will see and talk to you later.